What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Today we're here with Richard Sudan. He is a journalist with Press TV, and we want to talk to Richard, about his work in the media and also his activism. So, Richard, thanks for joining us on the show today.
That's an absolute pleasure to be here. I love what you guys do. Big fan of the channel. So, thank you for having me.
All right, Richard, tell people just a little bit, about yourself, your background, for those that may be your first time, viewing you.
Yeah, so I mean, what I do, I'm a political activist and a journalist. I've been doing this since about 2007. I've been politically kind of conscious since I was young, an activist since I was in my sort of 20s, which led me to become a journalist. I do a little music on the side. I've also taught writing poetry for performance at one university. So yeah, that's what I do. I've got my kind of areas of focus with journalism and activism. And yeah, here I am. I've worked for Russia Today in the past as a reporter, reported from around Europe, different places around the world. Also for Press TV, I've written for The Guardian, The Independent, and loads of other publications. So I've been doing this for a while now.
So I noticed that, what you definitely what got my attention with your reporting is that you was covering a lot of, the things that's going on in the United States, like with Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. But the way you was covering it, you wasn't covering it like maybe a CNN would cover it or MSNBC was covering it. And I say, well, that's interesting. And I started looking at, Press TV a little bit. And I'm a big fan of, media houses overseas because they're allowed to tell the truth a little bit more of what's going on outside of the, American mainstream media. But what got you to look more into what's going on here in the United States, especially in the guise of racism and white supremacy?
I think that's a great question. And I feel like a lot of people, I've always been hugely concerned about racism as a kind of global system, first of all. And I think, like a lot of people, I've always had an interest in the kind of history of Black people in America, African Americans. I mean, I read Alex Haley Roots when I was about 12. Same as Malcolm. I didn't really understand a lot of it. My whole life, I've been kind of deeply concerned about the condition of Black people in America. And in a nutshell, to answer your question, I kind of felt like with the death of George Floyd, I felt like finally the entire world is looking at the US. It's not really a new issue for me. I've written about it for a long time, spoken about it for a long time, but I felt like finally this kind of catalyst, if you like, got the world's attention. And so I've just kind of made an effort since then to just cover things as much as I can in the way I think they need to be covered. And yeah, just trying to keep people's attention really on white supremacy in the United States, because it seems to me it's so deeply tied to the system. And to be honest, I don't really see things really improving too much. So I think it's important that we deliver people the facts. And also, I think people want people's opinions. People want someone that's opinionated. People want to know what you think. I think a lot of people are kind of tired of the kind of traditional sort of model of media, if that makes sense.
Yes, sir. I agree with that. And part of our success is that just telling the truth is how we see it. But what you just mentioned about you really don't see anything improving. Why is that?
I mean, I think why it's not improving is because there's no real commitment to tackle the structural racism in the United States, be it the private prison system or be it policing in the United States. You've had a situation where the private prison system has really just grown massively since the Reagan era, since things like the '94 crime bill. Millions and millions have been pushed into that system. It's a revolving door of profit. It costs about $50,000 or more to house an inmate each year. And we know that Black people are massively disproportionately affected by it. I think Black people in the US are around 13% of the population, but make up almost half of the prison system. And of course, it says in the Constitution, quite clearly, slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime. And we know that post the Civil War period, labor was needed to rebuild the South. And I see it as the new form of slavery. And I think if more people understand how that system works, maybe if enough people know, something can be done about it. But I don't really see, in terms of how the police operate, they're able to just kill Black people with impunity. There's no punishment. There's no economic incentive for them to stop their behavior. They barely even lose their jobs. They barely even get reprimanded. Let's be honest about it. So it's a deeply concerning situation. I often think what it must be like to be black in the US at the moment. It's especially if you're raising kids, if you're raising young men, young women, it's a massive cause for concern. And I don't know how anybody who says they have a real concern about human rights cannot be concerned about it too.
You know, living in the U.S., it is definitely a concern, for sure. And I tell people that entity of police, you know, you do the research. It started as the slave patrol. So we have something from the slave patrol and morphed into the municipal police departments. And this is why you look at any police department throughout the world, even the ones in the African continent, all of them have abuse of power. All of them have some sort of form of corruption. And some of them just have outright criminals out there. But my thing is this. Why is it that people, if you know this entity of police is still corrupt in that manner, why is it that people still don't rear them in? Because I haven't found it don't matter where they come from, especially in America, it's the whole system. And that system is in the UK where you're located, because I tell different brothers, and sisters about things. I spoke to people, like Sasha Johnson, and she fights against police brutality all the time. But tell us a little bit about just how that system works in the UK. They say it's different, but it's really not.
It's different in the sense, our police, generally speaking, aren't armed as much as your police are there, although we do have so-called special units that are armed. I think the dynamic in principle is basically the same. If you look at the disparities in terms of how black people and non-white people are treated in policing, are treated in, for example, mental health facilities. If you look at, for example, the disparities in arrests and charges, you can be black in the UK and the facts show you're far more likely to be convicted of the exact same crime as a white person. That's just a fact. And you see these disparities in housing, in employment, in healthcare, in pretty much every aspect of life that you can imagine. And so we have a thing here. A lot of people really think kind of racism, a lot of people call it right-wing populism, whatever you want to call it. That thing in the streets right now in the UK is in such a frenzy that the racism in the street is basically becoming, the racism in the street today is basically becoming political policy tomorrow. I'm not going to pretend it's anywhere near as bad as it is in the United States, but there's definitely been a ramping up of, for example, the tax on, black people and non-white people in the street. And the statistics show, for example, that, Muslims are increasingly attacked in the street. Muslim women that wear the hijab, for example, are often attacked on public transport. You have, of course, the dynamic of the stop and search problem in the UK, particularly in cities, particularly in places like London. If you're young and black, the evidence shows you're far more likely to be stopped by the police. And just on that note, we deal with deaths in custody, in the UK too. And there's 2 cases at the moment that just happened in Wales within weeks of each other that have absolutely infuriated people. I mean, any death in custody is, horrendous, but these 2 cases in particular have really angered people. So yeah, it's the same. I mean, I really look at it as a global structure. We're not really dealing with it as bad as you guys are in the US in terms of police just going around just killing people with impunity. I mean, sometimes I'm scared to look on my timeline because it feels like every day there's a black person in the US just getting shot by a police officer.
Well, let me ask you another question here. When you mention the UK and you working in definitely different global media platforms, how's the US really looked at now ever since George Floyd? I mean, of course, we've been speaking about these issues prior to George Floyd and what happened to Breonna Taylor, but the world actually got to see those incidents, in real time or really know about them prior to maybe some of the other incidents. How's America viewed now, as you in your travels throughout the world and working with different media outlets?
One thing that's encouraged me now is that people are unapologetically, many more people, not enough, but they're calling racism, white supremacy for what it is. And I think what happened with the George Floyd situation certainly here is, let's be honest, black people have always been lynched in the United States, and the killing of George Floyd was a modern day lynching. And I think the difference is that because it was caught on camera, it kind of sparked a sort of collective trauma, not just amongst black people, but just amongst anyone that kind of watched it, really. And I think it kind of just sparked a whole kind of wave of, you know, protests. And I think where people were kind of in denial about racism before, less people are in denial about it now, because you can't deny it. I mean, one quote that always sticks in my head, I think it was Will Smith that said it. He said something like, racism isn't new, or racism isn't getting worse, it's just getting filmed. So I think with the advent of the camera phone, what's happened is more and more of these instances are just being captured in real time and shared across the world, often before you know, mainstream media outlets even pick them up. So you know, I remember for a few years in the UK, for example, you would call racism white supremacy, and a lot of well-meaning white people were kind of, you know, they get very offended by it. But now they understand that it's a structure and a system of power. So in the same way, of course, not all white people are racist. You have many people who are black or with a brown skin, I would argue, that also prop up that system. So I think more and more people now are seeing it as an ideology. And I really view the George Floyd situation as a catalyst. You know, everyone that saw that video was basically infuriated by it. And actually, it really, for me, it kind of made quite clear where people stand, because it brought out a lot of people's true colors. You're either against racism and you actively have to be against it, or you're for it. So you see a lot of people came out and tried to do the apologism for it. You saw a lot of people come out like the Candace Owens, and we have our versions over here, and they start digging into George Floyd's background as if it had anything to, as if there's any justification for it. And as, you know, Dave Chappelle said, he said, you know, everyone always asks the question, why are you holding George Floyd up? Well, black people didn't choose George Floyd. It was the system of white supremacy that chose George Floyd to be the catalyst when it killed him.
You mentioned Candace Owens. Now Candace Owens, you know, she is originally Caribbean. And, you know, your father, as you told me, is Caribbean, from Trinidad and Tobago. So let me ask you a question about that. You know, as you went, you know, with your family and different things like that. What is the overall sentiment of certain people in the Caribbean? You know, some people in the Caribbean want to come to America, some want to come to the UK. But how do we get a Candace Owens versus how we get someone like you say, you know what, hey, I got to fight against this system as much as possible because, you know, I got to fight for my people?
That's a great question. I think a lot of us from, you know, my dad was born in the UK, but a lot of us from Caribbean descent, I think if we're being honest, we've all seen that kind of anti-black racism from even people of black descent, but people, other non-white people in the Caribbean. And it's a weird hangover from, I would say, white supremacy or even Christian fundamentalism in the Caribbean. I mean, that's another track to go down. But there are a lot of us who are ashamed of the sellouts from, you know, our societies back there who practice that kind of racism. But what I would say is this: there are millions of people who are very proud of their lineage. Lineages in the Caribbean are often very mixed, and they're incredibly proud of their roots. We don't claim the Candace Owens. We're proud of the people like Claudia Jones, who came from Trinidad, the CLR Jameses, the Marcus Garveys. We really hold on to them, and we lift up and revere those kinds of people. I mean, Candace Owens and the people that are like her, at times it makes you almost want to be ashamed of being from the Caribbean, except there's a fantastic tradition of very strong anti-racist fighters coming from the Caribbean, and that tradition continues. But you've got your sellouts. You know, we have different names for them over here. I probably shouldn't repeat them. You have your sellouts from every society. The Caribbean is no different. But I would also say that that kind of that terrible sort of caste system that you have, and you have it in South America too. Jamaica's a bit more worse than Trinidad. That's a direct hangover really from the kind of white supremacy that was practiced in the Caribbean, the divide and rule tactic, if you like. You know, racism was so bad in the Caribbean that a lot of people just wanted to do anything to assimilate to whiteness. I mean, I'm not diminishing for one moment the experiences of Black people in America, but when we talk about slavery as it was practiced, slavery in the Caribbean, particularly in places like Jamaica and Haiti, was extra brutal. And I think all of these things kind of play into the sort of social dynamic you're kind of talking about now.
Yeah, especially like, and some people don't understand the history of how, you know, a lot of slaves were brought to the Caribbean first, like I said, to break them. And there was a lot of, you know, we also talk about the, you know, bug breaking that happened. That's why Jamaicans are really against anything, you know, LGBT. They don't even talk of that because, you know, of the history of, you know, slave masters up here, you know, raping men. I mean, that's the part of, you know, slavery they don't like to get involved with.
Right.
They may talk about the rape of women, but they don't talk about the rape of men and boys and how that was, you know, put on display literally. And they don't, in American history, we have such a sanitized version of slavery. When we talk here, you know, you have Black History Month. And I remember in school, you know, Richard, to me, what they taught is criminal because you literally miseducate, you know, everybody. And this is why you even have, you know, white people that don't know anything about their own history in this country and what they ancestors have been a part of, because they purposely miseducate children. And I can't speak on the UK education system, but I can definitely tell you here, they teach you such a sanitized version of history. They don't tell you the atrocities of slavery. They don't tell you what happened with the Native Americans. They don't even tell you that, you know, Native Americans even were Black people as well. They teach you just a white supremacist conquest, a little blurb about Martin Luther King. Cause we have like sanitized people they can teach, you know, Martin Luther King. Oh, he was such a great man, but yet they don't talk about they put a bullet in his neck. They don't talk about all different things they did to Martin Luther King. I mean, it's like horrible. They have a holiday for Martin Luther King, but the man that helped murder Martin Luther King, J. Edgar Hoover, and I'm pretty sure you heard about the new Malcolm X, you know, discovery now, which J. Edgar Hoover was behind. Yeah, you got the most racist, evil man that killed the most civil rights leaders. His name is on the building, J. Edgar Hoover FBI building. I mean, this country, like I call it wicked. You know, I call it very wicked, evil, and Babylon. But from the outside looking into America and how they operate with education and everything that's happened to our civil rights leader, you know, what people are saying, you know, abroad, because I always tell people we are more than just the shores of America, because America got a way of making you think we just it, and we don't live in a global, you know, society.
Again, I mean, I think that's a great question, a great point you make. I think more and more people are looking at the US and really starting to question the history now. I mean, I just wrote an article that's out soon that covers a lot of this stuff. And I really share your analysis. In my humble opinion, I mean, I'm still learning, but from what I know about the US, it seems to be a completely sanitized version of Black history. You don't really hear about the kind of Nat Turners. You hear a sanitized version often from about the story of Harriet Tubman. But just in terms of the UK, there's a parallel there, in my opinion, because, for example, you will hear about the great industrial revolution of the United Kingdom, but what you won't hear is how that revolution was massively financed, of course, by the slave trade in the US, the cotton industry, you know, shipping cotton to the UK, and you had the spinning, you know, the cotton mills in the United Kingdom. Of course, you have the slave trade. Now, I always say the UK's racism is kind of very cunning, and a lot of people say the UK really created the benchmark for racism. Everyone makes a big deal out of two things: the fact that slavery was never in the United Kingdom, which actually isn't true. There were slaves. I think the University of Glasgow has offered some studies into the facts that there were actual human beings as captives here in the UK. But there's another mythology that persists. Everyone always says Britain was the first country to end slavery. It wasn't. It was one of the first, I think, or the first to practice the slave trade. But of course, it was Haiti that ended slavery in 1804, before 1807. And again, just like the US, when you had the Civil War, when slavery ended, or the slave trade was banned from the UK participating in it, it wasn't some great moral epiphany in the middle of the night. It was really the conclusion, because of the uprisings in Jamaica with Sam Sharp and the uprisings in Haiti. They realized they just couldn't maintain their system how they wanted it anymore. But then you've got other examples. I mean, you know, you might have seen over there that Winston Churchill is often held up as the greatest Britain ever, and that he won the war. I mean, we could talk about the war another time. It was the soldiers that won the war, whatever we think about that, which was really a war of empires. But this is my point on Churchill. He was a practicing white supremacist. You know, Churchill said derogatory things about black people and about every non-white person or people in the world. You know, that's just a fact. But of course, if you mention the facts around Churchill, you get called a traitor. You get told to go home, even if you're born here like me. So there's a massive illusion in many ways, I would say, about Britain's true history. But I would say there are more and more people from all generations, but there are more and more people that kind of study the true history, as it were, and try to kind of spread that true history. For example, there's many people that used to house and look after runaway slaves. There's some great examples of people that were very much, you know, in the same way you've got these systems. If you really sort of dig, you know, below the surface, you always find examples of people that at the time were always right on the money, were always against this system and actively fighting against it.
And what people don't understand is Britain is the, you know, creator and author of white supremacy.
Right.
And I never understand why people they just focus on the US and don't focus on Britain. I say, you got to remember, it was British colonies that was bringing slaves first, before it was America, before, you know, we built America. And before it actually came about, it was the British that did that. The British started the slavery first here in America. Now they continued it out. You know, they lied to us. Our ancestors say, "Hey, you help us fight the British. You know, we'll give you freedom." But they just continued slavery from July 4th, 1776, until the Emancipation Proclamation. But we have to understand, it is Britain that owes reparations to everybody. It's not just U.S. government. No, it's the Britain or the Caribbean. The British actually owe my ancestors too. You really want to talk about reparations?
100%. There's no getting around that. You're speaking facts. You know, you've always had. I mean, slavery is not a new thing. I think the word slave even comes from Slavics who first enslaved each other. But the idea that you're going to enslave people and the kind of racist pseudoscience that underpins it, that definitely comes from Britain, the kind of pseudo-scientific justification for it. And of course, the Bible was also used as a way to kind of colonize people. But, you know, Britain really, I mean, in my humble opinion, it's had one of the biggest empires ever. The British Empire has, you know, an immeasurable amount of blood on its hands. But that legacy you see from the Caribbean and America, it was a very deep instilled ideology, and a lot of people really understand here that we kind of exported that ideology to the US in the sense, you know, many immigrants came from, you know, Britain, not just they came from Europe as well, but they went to America and they were sold that kind of lethal Kool-Aid of white supremacy. And I suppose that was the way to really keep all people really understanding how the system worked. And I suppose if you were a white immigrant going to America, if you looked around and you saw black people and maybe other non-white people that were maybe of a similar, not too dissimilar economic position from you, I suppose at least you kind of had your whiteness, which, you know, the idea was that was ordained almost from God. You know, the kind of Bible was used, the curse of Ham and other things in the Bible to really make people think and feel that slavery was justified and it was somehow a favor. And I mean, I mean, you mentioned the Caribbean before. I'm really glad you mentioned the fact that, you know, the homophobia that's practiced there, and it is practiced there, that's a direct hangover from Christian fundamentalism. People often sort of say, if you're of a Caribbean background or whatever, they say, well, what about the kind of homophobia in the Caribbean? And it's like, yeah, that's a direct export from white supremacy. You know, the buck breaking phenomenon that CLR James wrote about. I think Tariq Nasheed has got a film out about that dynamic, which I'm looking forward to see. So I'm really glad you mentioned that point, because I really think people need to kind of start viewing this system as a global system, which is what it is. And there's no way Britain gets away from its responsibility in that system. As I say, the whole thing here is Britain ended slavery. That's a big part of the kind of mythology here that still persists. You know, you mention Haiti to people, they don't want to hear about it. But I suppose for me, the older I got, the more I started to understand about things like Haiti. It's very clear why these things aren't taught in the history books, because these realities of history would kind of break the spell that many people are under, the kind of psychosis of racism and the kind of false history that people are given?
Well, like that particular term, I don't even use that term homophobic in my lexicon. I'm gonna tell you why I don't use it, because no one fears anybody that's gay. Nobody fears them. The fact is that my study of history, of just Black history and even African history, that just was foreign to our cultures. And that came a little bit more, if you do the research, with the European. Back in the day, he used to put his children in dresses. All the way up to about 6, 7 years old, because he couldn't afford to. If you look at what they used to do to boys in Rome, that was, pedophilia was heavily practiced in European history. So that is not, related to our culture. So for me, like I said, growing up, we knew a few people like that here and there. And from what I've seen, just the research as well, a lot of people had, sexual trauma a lot of times. And that wasn't reported, and that happens a lot, and people kind of go that way. But like I said, I'm not going to go into that conversation. That can get a deep conversation, but our brothers and sisters, like you said, it comes from slavery, and they just, like I said, the trauma of slavery is still in the DNA. And if you still have a white supremacist system, the same system that upheld slavery is still in operation today. So you still being traumatized on a daily basis, living in a, Western white supremacist system. And that's what people don't understand. We haven't really been made whole yet with reparations and even transformative change. So how can you say all this such a long time ago, when yet, once again, the police comes from slavery, still doing the same things?
Exactly. I mean, first of all, the arguments for reparations is a concrete one in terms of restorative justice, certainly in the US and elsewhere. And I think it's interesting in the US, I'm watching very closely, and there seems to be every group really seems to be kind of getting the nod from Joe Biden and resources allocated. And yet there was a big conversation in the run up to the election, and I remember clearly Joe Biden said to Black people, you've had my back and I'll have yours. I think a lot of people like me were extremely skeptical. And, I'm really sure the excuses are going to be made as to why there's not going to be reparations for Black people in the US, be it through tax breaks, resources allocated to certain majority Black area schools and so on and so forth. But, the argument will be that there's no money. And yet we saw during COVID, actually, not even just in the United States, we actually saw how all of a sudden there were millions upon billions of resources, all of a sudden being able to push to find a vaccine, because this is a disease which is, affecting people around the world, but definitely affecting European populations, because, of course, for historical and economic and social reasons, European countries often have a much older population. People are able to live a lot longer. And so there was a big priority for the money to be pushed into developing a vaccine. So, and of course, we see, there's always money available for whatever happens. And remember, of course, the global crash in 2008. And I think in the UK, there was billions signed to save the banks. I believe Obama signed billions or trillions, whatever it was. So there's always money available when they really need it. But when it comes to restoring the deficit, the injustice for the people that built the country, which is, foundational Black Americans or American descendants of slavery, there's always an excuse to be made. And I think it's shameful. And I hope more people around the world really start to look beyond what I would say is the superficiality of the Biden administration. I mean, I would love to be proved wrong, but you often just see a kind of superficial change, maybe a change in rhetoric, maybe a change in words. But I think if you look at President Joe Biden's track record and just don't listen to some of his words you need to listen to, because he made a few big clangers in the run up to the election. But I think his track record regarding Black America speaks for itself.
Oh, no, you talking about Jim Crow Joe? Don't get me started on Jim Crow Joe. Jim Crow Joe has said, even about reparations, he said that he, feels that he should not be responsible for nothing his ancestors did, a long time ago. Like I said, Jim Crow Joe is Trump all over again. And black folks starting to see that he's Trump just a little bit more in a sinister way to me. Now that would be a whole conversation getting to talk to Jim Crow Joe. But, you know, people are seeing Jim Crow Joe for who he really is. It's not taking long. I mean, he pulled the wool over a lot of, you know, older black people's eyes, and they were so scared of Trump. But now I believe we got something a little worse. But, you know, with that said, Richard, tell people how they can, you know, get in contact with you or watch your program on Press TV.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Richard Sudan. I've got a YouTube channel by the same name, Richard Sudan, Sudan like the country, Sudan. Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter. I'm not hard to find. So I'm posting up regular content, reports, and yeah, just get in touch, connect, and yeah, I look forward to that.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, make sure you contact Richard. You know, he got some good stories coming out, and you know, he's definitely a supporter, and we definitely rock with Richard. So Richard, you know, you take care out there in the UK, you know, and say a prayer for the family.
Absolutely. Much respect to yourself. Thank you for having me on, and much love and respect to everyone tuning in, the wider diaspora. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.